Okay.
Okay. Hey.
Hey.
Calling Chris Anderson in studio W1.
Yes. Well, sort of, kind of. Yes. At this very moment, I'm in studio W1. But when you watch this, I won't be. I will be in the Ardennes, and you will not be in your well-carpeted studio either, will you?
I will not be here I don't have a good name for my studio, high above Michigan Avenue in Chicago, but I will be at the Chicago Bears game. The Bears.
And by this point, will they have lost already, or will they be in the process of losing?
The game, I think, by this point will just have no, it'll be like in the fourth quarter. It'll be in
so
the
they'll
fourth
definitely
quarter.
have lost though by this point. And you'll be asking yourself, why didn't I just do the show and save myself the money? But
I could have saved the money, avoided freezing. I think the temperature is supposed to be a high of 15 degrees. And, life is full of decisions that one reflects on later. And
I'm sure I'll be freezing too, because I'll be in the woods pointing at trees and going,
and holes in the ground that probably were made well after World War II.
Maybe.
I'm just saying.
Maybe.
I mean, if
not the ones I show people.
Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Steve. Oh, wow, you've just gone.
A blizzard is going on.
Chris has just gone all cloudy on me. I'm not sure what's going on there. Okay. But thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. Can we not? What can we do?
I'll remove and come back. Maybe I'll see.
Try it. Try it. Okay. Wow. Chris Anderson, fuzzy, but now we're bringing
still
it back.
Fuzzy.
Still fuzzy. Okay.
Wait. Okay. I could do this too.
Okay, that's tricky.
I'm gonna try it.
You're seeing now all of the inside baseball. This is
but I know it's crazy. Let me see if I can change my camera.
Wild times here at History Happy Hour. Perhaps we should edit this material out. Okay. Do you want me to edit that material out?
No,
Chris?
I think this is like what's up to you, Rick. You're
all
the
right,
executive producer, but I think just they get to see how the sausage gets made. So.
Well, I was just saying, okay, check out Stephen Ambrose Tours' rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening to the HHH
podcast.
Yeah, we're here, and we're glad you're here. And
today, no, go ahead, sir.
Go ahead, yeah. No,
I would say this is why I have the cricket worry ball for moments just like this.
Right, because now you can squeeze that and still maintain that calm, placid, pleasant demeanor that you're famous for.
Just like Belle Starr did.
Yes, and we'll be talking about Belle Starr today on History Happy Hour. Let us know what you're drinking. We sure hope you've started by now. Because we certainly have. And Chris, we should thank everybody who supports us via Patreon, especially our top shelf patrons.
Who we appreciate a lot.
We deeply appreciate them. We really should find something special to do for them. So let's think about how we can do that maybe before the end of the year. All right.
Okay.
And you can join this group by going to patreon.com/History Happy Hour. I think we're ready to roll, Chris. Give me a cue and we'll get started.
There you go. You brought it. I feel better.
I did. The bar is open. Hey, if you're like me, when you hear the name Belle Starr, you think, okay, Western outlaw. And chances are that this picture or some similar picture comes to mind. And maybe you don't know a whole lot more than that. I would say, Chris, that her star has risen and fallen over the years. See what I did there? Yeah. And there's a new book coming out about her on Tuesday. It's called Queen of All Mayhem. It is by Dane Hucklebridge. Dane is a Midwesterner living in Paris. He is both a novelist and nonfiction writer. This is his fifth book. He's also a graduate of Princeton, which will be a stop on the new Revolutionary War tour that I am scouting. So let me say
that one in.
Yeah, Dane Hucklebridge, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Excellent. Did you bring a cocktail?
I'm in Paris, and it was easier to get wine than a cocktail, so I brought something. I was saying I would have loved to have an old fashioned, but bourbon was a little trickier to get, so I'm making do with wine.
One of your first books was about bourbon, right?
Yeah, my very first book I ever did was it's called Bourbon: A History of the American Spirit. It was just a history of America told through bourbon, which was the research was fun. I'll say that.
Why didn't we have you on History Happy Hour for that?
I don't know. That was a while back. It may not have existed back then.
It was more than 5 years ago.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're drinking bourbon there from the guy. Now look, Dane, let me just ask you a question. Since you went to Princeton, have you ever been to the Battle of Princeton battlefield? And by the way, a lot is riding on your answer.
I'm not positive I have.
Okay, actually, nothing is riding on your answer.
Off the top of my head, I'd say no, but it's possible I did it.
It's about 1.4 miles from Nassau Hall, and Nassau Hall is actually also part of the Princeton battlefield because colonial forces fired a cannon that actually hit Princeton Hall, Nassau Hall.
That I remember. I remember there was. I don't remember.
Remember that
on the spot, but they. Well, not the cannonball, but I remember there was some supposed mark where a cannonball had hit, or was.
Yeah, I was looking for it. I couldn't find it.
So
I was
technically
there.
speaking, then he has been to the Battle of
Technically
Princeton,
speaking,
because-
he has
all right,
been.
So give
All right,
him cut him some
indirectly,
slack.
yeah, sure.
All right, fair enough. Okay, Dane, let's get started. And let me just throw it out there. First question: who is Belle Starr? Because I don't know that everybody in 2025 has as much of an idea as like I did when I was a kid reading about her. Can we start with a bit about her to set the stage? Tell us a little bit about this lady.
Certainly, Belle Starr was a female outlaw, bandit, smuggler, stick-up artist, horse thief, who was sort of a local celebrity and local terror in the Texas area around Dallas and in what was then Indian Territory, modern day Oklahoma, and who got in all sorts of hijinks and scrapes and trouble with both tribal authorities and federal authorities, the U.S. Marshals. And she lived a very tumultuous life. She ran with some very interesting characters, with Jesse James, Cole Younger, Jim Reed, other famous outlaws. Eventually married into the Starr family, which was a very kind of locally powerful and somewhat dangerous family in the Cherokee Nation. And eventually she was executed gangland style. She was shot off her horse from behind and then killed at point blank range with a second blast of buckshot. And the verdict is still out on who killed her. That's one of the history's great unsolved mysteries. And I talk about that a fair amount in the book too, trying to put forth some different theories on who might have pulled the trigger.
All right. So, Dane, one of the things, like kind of as a baseline, because one of the things I find interesting is she seems to be a character that everybody knew something about, and now she doesn't really pop up. She's not we're not conscious of her. What's the world that she's kind of brought into? You talk about 1848 and her kind of start in life. So describe, where she comes from, what her background was like.
Sure. I think her family is essentially a prime example of westward migration, the story of Appalachian westward migration. One thing that's interesting on her dad's side, though, there's often this common perception that she was a typical kind of Scots-Irish, rootin' tootin', whiskey drinking, whatever. But in fact, her origins are German, and that's one sort of the second big group you don't hear as much about that settled Appalachia. There's the Scots-Irish, but also there's this very large group of Germans who followed a similar route. Both the Scots-Irish and the Germans, this first wave of German immigrants, settled in Pennsylvania. Then they kind of filtered down into Virginia, towards Western Virginia, then through the Cumberland Gap, through Kentucky, and then into the upland South and Southern Midwest, the Ozarks. So there's sort of this steady migration. Her family is a classic example of that. And they started out in Pennsylvania, like I said, followed that western route, and they ended up in Carthage, Missouri, which is on the southwestern Missouri, right on the very edge of the Ozarks, which is a sort of a common destination point. And this part of southern Missouri was very pro-Confederate, very strong Southern sympathies at that time. And there were some transplanted, Yankees, Northerners too, but the majority of the people were transplanted Southerners who, mostly from the upland South, but also other parts of us who'd made this westward migration. So they carried that kind of culture and those beliefs and those things with them. And so that's the milieu she grew up in southwestern Missouri. And then you had, Bleeding Kansas, these sort of, the beginning, which is sort of a precursor of the actual Civil War, these fights between what would soon become, Jayhawkers and bushwhackers and whatever, these sort of paramilitary forces. Right. And so she grew up in this milieu of tension and like a fair amount of violence between the, people who would come to be pro-Confederate and people who would come to be pro-Union, pro-North. And when the Civil War finally erupted, her family was very much pro-Southern, pro-Confederacy. And her brother joined the local militia and became effectively a Confederate guerrilla. And one of the interesting things about her, it's become part of folklore, but based on research, there seems to be a fair amount of enough evidence to say that it's true to an extent, as she was kind of a teenage Confederate spy for these paramilitary groups, for these guerrillas. They were part of this Confederate insurgency when the Union occupied Missouri. And what she did, it was very dangerous for local young men at that time. If they were caught walking around town, whatever, the Union troops or militias would pull them over and question them. And when things got really bad, occasionally just kind of kill them on sight, because it was assumed they were part of the bushwhackers, these Confederate guerrillas. But she, as a teenage girl, could sort of slip through lines without getting hassled quite so much. And apparently she did a fair amount of reconnaissance and spying for her brother and his band of Confederate guerrillas. So that was, I think, her first taste of violence, of excitement, of the thrill of doing something, of the chase, of the hunt, whatever. Yeah. And she was very much exposed to the horrors of the Civil War. I mean, she was there. She was there for the Battle of Carthage. She saw the bullets fly. She saw people getting killed. And it's something that's forgotten today, I think. But the effect that the Civil War had on Missouri, particularly this part of Missouri, was disastrous. I mean, whole counties were depopulated. Towns were burned down. And that's eventually what happened to her town, Carthage. And shortly before that, when things were getting very bad, and her brother at this point was killed by militia troops, her whole family left and followed many other pro-Confederate Missourians and going south and resettling in Texas outside of Dallas. And there's this big community of these sort of displaced, almost refugees from Missouri. And that's where she settled. And it's interesting, that had an enormous effect on the development of outlaw culture. And it was her segue into outlaw culture, Wild West outlaw culture, and her whole cohort of young men, because you had all these guerrillas who were trained in the art, in deadly force. And, they've sort of become proto-bandits. They were used to holding up Union stagecoaches and robbing Union, treasury convoys and things like this, these sort of skills on horseback with revolvers, things like that. And they acquired these skills, and then in the aftermath of the Civil War, they weren't granted the same clemency most other Confederates were, because they weren't acknowledged as uniform wearing Confederates. They were just kind of, bushwhackers. They were considered sort of bandits. And because many of them feared prosecution after the war, they fled to Texas, and the local economy was in ruins anyway. And without any sort of trade to turn to, they ended up going towards the one thing they had, which was their guns. And it's this experience created this outlaw class, particularly in this part of Texas. And Belle Starr was very much part of that. And her first husband, Jim Reed, was exactly like that. He was one of Quantrill's raiders, a Confederate guerrilla. So were Jesse James, so were Cole Younger. So you had these band of former Confederate guerrillas who made the not very big leap into becoming Western outlaws. And Belle Starr I wouldn't say sucked along, because I think she was a pretty willing participant. I think she really enjoyed the outlaw life, but that was her entree into the outlaw life.
So can we talk a little bit about the Wild West? Was there ever such a thing outside of Hollywood? When and where was it? And how does Belle Starr fit into it? I mean, you seem to suggest that if there was a Wild West, it's kind of starting in that post-Civil War period when she's just turning 17 or 18. Is that kind of when it's happening? What's going on there?
Yeah, I think, the idea of the West in American history has always been somewhat plastic and open to interpretation, because it's always, Western expansion, what we think of, quote unquote, the frontier, was always pushing westward along with European colonization. So that's always been changing. In colonial times, it was the very edge of the Appalachians. Like that was sort of the frontier, and then it kept going westward. And I think there were two pretty big spurts, and they both had to do with wars. The first was after the Revolution, when America got its independence. That opened up the kind of trans-Appalachian frontier, which had formerly the British. The British was sort of a hornet's nest of French and hostile and ally Native American tribes, and the British just tried to keep American settlers from crossing that boundary, the trans-Appalachian frontier. The American Revolution opened up that first burst of Western expansion. So all these people settling, pouring through the Cumberland Gap, going west. And I think the other big burst, and then it steadily went westward after that. But the other big burst, I think, was the other big war, was the Civil War. And I think that kind of the end of the war, the end of these sort of tensions with adding on states, and adding on, trying to keep this balance between slave states and free states. When that was all over, and then coupled with the introduction of the railroad and other things, you had this other big burst of Western expansion. And when we think of the Wild West, I think that's the period we're really thinking about, from right at the end of the Civil War, right around 1865, 1866, up until probably around 1890, when there weren't that many areas left where you could get away being a rootin' tootin' criminal, or where there were essentially Native American rebellions against this colonization ended. You had I guess you could say the Wild, in the sort that it became under federal, pretty like strong federal authority. I would say that happened roughly. I mean, it's open to interpretation, but I say around 1890, something like that. So I'd say roughly you could say what we consider the Wild West would be from the end of the Civil War up until around 1890.
So basically for Belle Starr's entire adult life.
Basically, yeah. I mean, that's what's fascinating about her as a character, is she was there. I think I say in the book, there at the start of it and there in the heart of it. Her career as a criminal essentially spanned the opening and the end of the Wild West era, and she saw it firsthand.
So, Dane, I mean, I want to kind of go back to it because I think it's a really interesting point that you make. Talk a little bit more about that connection between kind of the after effects of the Civil War and what's happening in the West. Because I think, in most people's perception, there's the Civil War, lease surrenders at Appomattox, and then all of a sudden there's westward movement and homesteaders and all that great things happen. But you do a really good job of explaining that connection between the violence of the war and what comes after.
Sure, I guess expounding a little bit on what I hinted at before. Not all Wild West outlaws obviously were former Confederate Missouri guerrillas, but you had this core group who couldn't, they didn't want to go back to Missouri because they're worried they might get either hung by, tried by officials or lynched by kind of mobs, so now that the war was over. And they'd acquired all these skills. It was almost like that was a training ground to be a Wild West outlaw. And the things when you think of the classic Wild West type capers, chasing down stagecoaches, running down, train robberies, bank stickups, kind of horse banditry, these type of things. These were all skills that were mastered in the guerrilla campaigns, particularly by groups like Quantrill's Raiders, things like that, during the Civil War. And because all these young men, and this is something, in different points in history, you see that a lot. That's why, if in war, when you occupy a country and an army surrenders, it's good to have some sort of plan for what to do with all these young men with battle skills who suddenly need to earn a living. And in there's plenty of examples of this both in recent history and going back. And in the case of these former guerrillas, there wasn't really any accommodation made for them, and they suddenly had this relatively lawless frontier that was just their blank canvas. And one thing that's also very interesting in the case of Belle Starr, they had these existing relations with native nations and Indian territory. Because one thing that's really interesting about the Civil War, you have some of these, particularly, I talk a lot about the Cherokee Nation. they, for the most part, supported the Confederacy, and they actively helped out Confederate guerrillas in Missouri and Confederate troop movements there. Because, as a matter of fact, there were many powerful Cherokee families who owned slaves and were pro Confederacy. And in their working together, these kind of relationships they had, particularly during the winters, it was hard to hide out in Missouri, to hide out in the woods as a guerrilla band in the winter. So oftentimes they would flee, and they would usually either go to Texas, where many of them would end up later, or go to Indian territory, kind of staying with their hosts, their Cherokee hosts, or what other nations participated too, but I'm talking mostly about Cherokee. And they established these relationships. You start to see the inkling of what would have later, because they would kind of pay tribute in a way. Like they would also engage in horse theft and cattle rustling as their kind of banditry and the excuse of supporting their Confederate cause. And then some of these Cherokee families, the Starr family among them, Tom Starr was very active, as well as some other families, would help fence some of these cattle and provide these guerrillas with hiding places and shelter during the winter, whatever. And these relationships continued after the war was over. And essentially it was very similar, where these same Confederate guerrillas were now Texas Wild West outlaws. But after a big score, a big caper, they would hide from federal authorities in the Cherokee Nation. They would go back with the Stars or other families like that, using them as hideouts. The cattle they rustled, the horses they stole, they would still kind of use them as fences to sell in Indian territory. And they probably would start engaging in some whiskey smuggling and things like that too. And that's the beginning of this really critical relationship with the Cherokee, with certain parties within the Cherokee Nation, particularly with the Starr family. And Belle Starr's first husband, Jim Reed, that was his initial, he was, it's sort of like organized crime, like the mafia. He got involved in lots of sorts of different types of crime. But one of his big income drivers, I think, was working with the Stars to run whiskey smuggling between Fort Smith and the Cherokee Nation, other these native nations there. So he was working the kind of white, the white world outside of it, where the federal government had authority. He was bringing the whiskey in, and he was giving it to the probably Tom Starr and his associates, who would distribute it throughout Indian territory and throughout the Cherokee Nation. So it's sort of, when you look at modern day drug smuggling routes and stuff like that, it was kind of similar. It was just whiskey smuggling at the time. Yeah. And that was Jim Reed's and Belle Starr's first one of the first big criminal enterprises and connections to the Starr family was that.
So, Dane, I want to ask you about how serious a criminal Belle is, and I'm going to admit to some skepticism, but I'm sure you can handle it. She's definitely hanging out with criminals, marrying at least one, if not two, criminals. She is. You can make the argument that when it comes to her active participation, well, she did a little horse thieving, for which she spent a year in prison, and she had her photo taken wearing guns a few times. Didn't kill anybody. She wasn't in any legendary, raids or enterprises. So, how big time a criminal was she? What's your evidence?
That's been a point of debate for some time, because you're this initial legend that was, started in the late 1800s after her death, of this, this outlaw queen, this bandit. And there was, the journalism and dime novels, whatever at the time, they like to romanticize this stuff. And there was a great deal of exaggeration. The very first books, some of the very first things written about her did take real liberties and, exaggerated things. So it's true. And I think there was also a backlash to a certain extent in the 20th century where some Western historians started to cast doubt and say, oh, there's not really any evidence she'd ever did anything than steal a couple horses, and kind of associated somewhat with criminals. But I think just in researching the book, I'll preface it by saying, anytime you're looking into something like this, it specifically is that I make the argument she was essentially involved in organized crime, with the equivalent of kind of a Cherokee mafia and Wild West frontier organized crime at the time. It's hard to, so much goes on in the shadows. It's hard to document a lot of it. And that's, I think I make the comparison. Al Capone, they had to bust him on tax evasion, because everyone knew he was basically what he was up to, but it was very hard to get concrete proof of it. And I think to an extent, there's some of that going on here with Belle Starr. And you read, from her trials, from, the way journalists wrote about her. I mean, it was acknowledged at that time in her in the court proceedings, in the records from her trials, the way court reporters wrote, it was acknowledged that she was this kind of, they even used the term outlaw queen, that she led a band of horse thieves and outlaws. So there's, to a certain extent, it is hard to pinpoint a lot. But looking at more solid evidence, I think the solid thing is she was arrested or charged 3 times with crimes, twice with horse theft, which actually was a fairly serious crime at that time, and once with armed robbery, essentially, larceny. And 2 times she beat the charges, and 1 time she didn't. And that was the first time, that was when she went to Detroit to serve her prison sentence. But I think one thing that really convinces me, aside from reading the court records where she talks about intimidating witnesses and, pointing guns at people, stuff like that, the thing that really convinces me is the amount of resources that the authorities put into putting her behind bars. And it's really clear when you're reading about this. I mean, they had to stage a manhunt the first time she was arrested and chased her like towards the Osage Nation, where she and her husband were trying to go into hiding. They were constantly raiding her property, Younger's Bend, this ranch, looking for evidence of crimes, things like that. And as you read her story, you read the primary sources documents, you realize that both federal authorities and tribal authorities were exerting tremendous amounts of resources to try to put her behind bars at a time when, Indian territory at that time was as wild as the Wild West got. I mean, it was crawling with outlaws and bandits and cutthroats and things like that. So if they were willing to put in this much time and also use the court resources, the docket was packed at the court. They really, they didn't really waste their time going after small timers because there was just so many criminals and outlaws to chase. And when you look at all these factors together, it becomes clear that, the sort of, while the legend definitely has been aggrandized to a certain extent over the years, that she was, the only explanation is she was actually sort of a leader of an organized crime group. And that's why they're investing so many resources into putting her behind bars and why she did end up behind bars. And I think probably the last thing I'd add in that is just the way she met her demise, when arguing whether or not she was a real gangster. I mean, she died a gangster's death. She died face down in the at some point, one of these, it's almost like a Scorsese movie or something. She angered someone enough, made enough enemies that at some point someone, like I said, executed her gangland style. So when you're looking at all of this together, some of it's sort of circumstantial or anecdotal evidence, but also just the court records and how journalists wrote about her and the fact that they did charge her with 3 separate times with fairly serious crimes. I think it was enough to convince me that she was the real deal, that it wasn't just, like someone like Calamity Jane, for example. Right. As I understand it, from what I've read, there's not a lot of evidence that she could really lived up to the reputation. I think a lot of it was just kind of tall tales and whatnot. And same thing, Annie Oakley, she definitely was a sharp shooter. She definitely had great aim, but I'm not sure there's sort of this legends built up for the Wild West shows and whatnot. But I think Belle Starr was definitely the real deal.
So Dave, speaking of legend, and since you've sort of resuscitated her for modern readers, how well known was she then? And is she promoting whatever public image she has, or are people just fascinated by her then, or is she just a kind of a local hero? I mean,
I think during her lifetime, when she was living even prior to that, because of some of the men she ran with, particularly her first husband, Jim Reed, I think she was a bit of a local legend in her lifetime, like around Indian Territory, that area of Fort Smith, Arkansas, North Texas. You have this little outlaw corridor where I think she was known in that area, and she fought, she embraced this image. She wanted to be seen as this, the same way, some of the famous, mafia dons in history would be seen, ringside at boxing matches, in the fancy clothes, the fur coats, whatever. I mean, there's a perfect image. She cultivated this image of kind of an outlaw queen wearing these feathered pinned hats and, black dresses and with hurt kerchiefs and, always wearing guns at her side. So she definitely embraced it. I think I don't think it was just posturing, because where she was living at that time, it wasn't really safe to posture as an outlaw. You had to back up your strut. And I have a hard time believing she would have, lasted very long in these places if she hadn't been able to back up her strut with the threat of violence. And there are at least anecdotal, stories about her directly confronting police and almost, kind of daring them to arrest her and getting into shouting matches and scuffles and things like that on the street. So I think she embraced it and cultivated it. I think she loved being an outlaw. She loved being a gangster the same way, certain mafia dons and, in more recent history kind of embraced the role, things like that. And I think she reveled in it. And I think it was part of her image, but I don't think she was really known nationally until after her death. And after her death, you had Fox, who was this, and he was sort of like a tabloid true crime, also boxing promoter, just kind of
she gets on Fox News and it all changes, right?
Yeah, but yeah, this guy Fox, he heard the story, and I do think he'd kind of had a few small mentions of her in his police gazette, his true crime gazette before. But after her death, he decides like, oh, this story is too good to be true, and publishes her first biography, which did take a lot of liberties, did fabricate a lot of stuff. But there's a fair amount of truth in it too. And that's when her story, when she started to become a household name, that was right after death. This would have been the 1890s. And from there, I think her story effectively took off, and you start to have kind of folk songs, stories, plays, poems. Then when Hollywood came along, you started to have movies about her life. And she did become, I think, more of a household name. And then in the post-war years, I talk about in this book, she faded a bit from the public consciousness to the point where it's not as if nobody knows who she is. There are still, people who spark, particularly if you grew up at the time when Westerns were still really, really big. I think there's still, some people know who she is, but not like generations prior, I think. And I talk about that a bit in the beginning of the book too. Why in the, during the Cold War years, the post-war years, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, you see her be forgotten a little bit, which is, in a way, I argue, is unfortunate, because unlike some of these other female Wild West characters whose legend has lived on, she actually was the real deal. She actually went to prison. She actually pulled guns on people. She actually, held. I mean, it's hard. A lot of this is hard to prove, but participated in armed robberies disguised as a man and stole horses and gold and things like that. So that's something I talk about in the book too, which I can go into more of that if you want. But that's an interesting sort of cultural study.
Well, I want to remind everybody that we are chatting today with Dane Hucklebridge, who's the author of Queen of All Mayhem, about the Western outlaw Belle Starr. So she is born Maybelle Shirley. How does she become Belle Starr?
Well, the short answer is through marriage, but it was sort of a long and winding road, because her very first husband was Jim Reed. And so for a while she was Belle Reed, and at this point, Jim Reed was starting to be getting into serious banditry. And he participated in one of the bigger heists in the history of Indian Territory, the Grayson robbery, where he, two accomplices, and Belle Starr was there as kind of a sidekick. She didn't participate in the actual robbery, but I think she was more of kind of a lookout outside of the ranch, watching the horses, waiting, being a lookout. But she was there for it. She was there when they split up the gold and when they made their getaway while getting pursued by people who are not too happy about all this. But that was her entree into banditry, was Jim Reed. It is a great story. I mean, there's a lot of much longer stories you can tell. But finally, he was a bit of, when you think of those kind of gangster movies, like the one who's a bit of a loose cannon, who gets into trouble, who isn't disciplined and kind of shoots off his mouth, whatever, spends all their money instead of being smart with the money, blows it all at the casino. Jim Reed was a bit like that. And they had a big falling out because after this Grayson robbery, they made $32,000 in gold, which is, it's a lot of money today. Back then it was enormous. That was just an incredible sum of money. And Jim Reed, instead of being responsible and sharing it with his wife, Belle Reed at the time, and sort of investing in their future and being smart about it. He blew it all on gambling, horse races.
I just got to say, though, that it may be a little much to expect a Western outlaw to be responsible with their investments.
Yeah, no, that's. I mean, this is part of the reason.
Maybe you're maybe asking too much.
Yeah, that's part of the reason you see this repeat. You know, same thing with like Jesse James. I think they embraced the lifestyle. They would get these big scores, and then they would live it up. I mean, that was,
you get the whores at the bordello and tip everybody $100 or whatever.
Yeah, so that's definitely what Jim Reed did. And at one part, he got a mistress and left Belle and ran off, and ended up getting into more trouble. And this was their big falling out, and it was probably the best for Belle, because he ended up getting himself killed by a bounty hunter. There's this bounty hunter who was sort of pretending to be his friend and convinced him he had a great idea for the next score when he was in hiding and on the run. And eventually this bounty hunter killed him. And I talk about this in the book, but that's a great, an incredible movie-worthy scene of this epic like struggle where Jim Reed has half his face blown off and is gushing blood everywhere and wrestling him to the ground, and eventually he subdues him. So that was the death of Belle's first husband. And after that, she had this difficult period where I think she was a little bit lost, and she had 2 kids at this point too. And this is sort of a lost period in her life. Eventually, she started shacking up with a sort of gambler, perhaps minor outlaw named Bruce Younger, and they did get married, but it was a disastrous sort of, almost like, I mean, not literally Las Vegas. They didn't get married in Vegas. One of these kind of like disastrous Las Vegas type weddings that lasted a couple weeks, and then I think he ran off on her for reasons that still aren't entirely clear. And at this point, I think Belle Starr had enough, and also she was tired of playing second fiddle to these male outlaws and never kind of getting her chance to do her thing. And that's when she just cuts a beeline straight to the Cherokee Nation and almost directly marries Sam Starr, who is the son of Tom Starr, this local Cherokee strongman, kind of political boss, arguably a Cherokee mafia leader. And she marries into this family. And suddenly, and I talk about this in the book too, I think there are historical reasons why she probably had more liberties as a woman in the Cherokee Nation versus sort of Anglo world of the frontier, and she works her way up the ranks of this Cherokee crime family, and eventually gets her own little gang, and alongside her husband, who he also eventually gets killed, Sam Starr. But they're running this little their own outfit, their own small crime syndicate, and they start getting involved in horse theft was one of their big things, and stickups and other things like that. And that angered local tribal authorities, the Cherokee police, who had a lot of historical reasons for not liking the Starr family to begin with, going back to the Cherokee Civil War, and also just weren't crazy about Belle, this outsider, coming and causing trouble. And the U.S. Marshals, who also were not happy about what she was doing, they got involved too. And you have this sticky situation where the U.S. Marshals kind of had, I mean, ultimately they did have authority, but things got sticky on Indian reservations. And then the tribal authorities, it was also sticky because they had to be careful with how they dealt with white residents on the reservations. So you had these two groups of authorities who had to figure out, all right, we got to figure out a way to do this. And they started actually colluding and working together to try to put Belle Starr and her husband behind bars.
So Dane, you mentioned a Cherokee word, and if I mispronounce it, I apologize. Chigau? Chigau?
Gigao is how I've heard it.
Okay, then that's probably right then. But what is that word, and what does it mean, and how does it apply to Belle?
Sure. Yeah, I certainly don't speak Cherokee, so I apologize if I'm not getting it just right. But there's this tradition in Cherokee history, and it's essentially a role in tribal authority and also spiritual authority called the Gigao, which is it's hard to explain exactly, but it's usually a woman figure who proved herself in battle or war or did something courageous for her clan and for her tribe. and showed themselves to be a leader, and were given this position where they were allowed to participate in tribal leadership, and also in, given kind of a religious role as well. It was just this kind of both sacred and political role where they became leaders within the community and had a fair amount of say over tribal affairs. And probably the most famous of these figures was Nancy Ward, Nanyehi, who she proved herself in I believe it was the Battle of Taliwa, this tribal battle against the Creek in northern Georgia. And she was chewing bullets to try to make their edges more jagged to give to her husband to shoot at the enemy. And at some point, her husband at the time got killed, and she picked up his rifle and kind of led the charge and ended up leading the Cherokee forces to victory. And because she displayed such courage and such leadership, she was given this role. And she ended up playing a very big part in guiding her people through this tumultuous period when they were negotiating all these white settlers, following the Revolutionary War, pouring into their lands and trying to figure out how to negotiate, keep their land, keep their sovereignty alongside this onslaught of American settlers, of Euro-American, Anglo-American settlers. And even to this day in Cherokee culture, for the Cherokee people, she has this very honored position. And so there was this legacy of a female figure, a female warrior, a female leader. And I have to think that, not that directly, that, specifically Belle thought, this this is a good place for me because of this, but it's more indicative of Cherokee culture, which was matrilineal, where property and custody of children and clan membership would pass down through females, not through males, where I think traditionally women had a much larger role in politics and society, and also were I think what was kind of marriage, sexual relationships, things like that. It was much more. It wasn't quite as strict and buttoned down as what Belle had become accustomed to in Anglo society, where essentially women were kind of almost considered property and didn't have that many rights, and that's what she was bucking against. And I have to think that part of what appealed to her in Cherokee society and marrying into this Cherokee family, living in Cherokee Nation, is that she thought that she did have sort of more liberty, more opportunities for self-determination, more opportunities to do what she wanted. And that's effectively what she did. She became, like I said, she became the de facto leader of this, crime group. And in the Cherokee Nation, at this ranch she lived on called Younger's Bend. And, I think that would have been difficult in just if she'd just been in Texas and Anglo society. And also what I think is ironic about it, when you look at what she ended up, her main sources of income, one was stealing horses and bartering horses. And the other was her ranch served as a hideout for lots of these famous outlaws. Like Jesse James at one point used her Younger's Bend ranch as a hideout. And these outlaws would pay tribute. They would have a big score. They would come stay with her, give her some protection money. So she was essentially in the hospitality industry. And those are the two things her father had done back in Carthage, Missouri. He raised horses, he was a horse breeder, and he ran a hotel and became the sort of community leader because he was a proper businessman. And so essentially she didn't stray that far from the family business. It was just, as a woman, there was no way for her to do it, in Anglo frontier society. So she said, forget this, and she went and did it illegally in the Cherokee Nation instead.
So, I'm noticing that on our comments page, we don't have any comments since 4:07 p.m., which is really unusual. So I'm wondering if there's a technical problem there. So I'd ask you, if you're watching, if you have a question, please put it in. If you could just let us know if you'd heard of Belle Starr before this show and what you knew about her. Even that information would help us, and then it would help us to know that the comments are working. Dana, I want to ask you about how she becomes famous after her death. And you talked about this a little bit, but she's killed when she's 41. And let's not get too deep into that because it's the denouement of the book, and we don't want to kind of give it away. We want people to buy copies of your book. How does she transform into a legendary figure? And if you're ruminating a little bit, what does that say about the America that kind of buys into the transformation of this relatively local criminal to this huge legendary figure?
I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier at the end of the Wild West era. So she was killed in 1889, which is really the very end of this, what we consider the Wild West era. And I think already as it's winding down, there's this tremendous appetite, kind of nostalgia appetite among Easterners back in the cities and Midwesterners in cities for stories from this vanishing frontier, true stories of adventure and shootouts and outlaws and what have you. And her death just occurred at this very propitious moment. And it almost through maybe coincidence, I don't know, a dispatch from one of these local papers right around Indian Territory, Arkansas, where she was killed, made its way to the New York Times. And because, the New York Times for them, it was exotic. It was fascinating. Oh, like a lady bandit, this lady outlaw from Indian Territory in Oklahoma. People will be interested in this. They wrote this obituary about her. So you had this big obituary in the New York Times about the death of Belle Starr. And it, that sparked people's interest, one of whom was the editor of this, true crime gazette that was run out of New York City, this tabloid that loved to publish salacious, detective stories and Wild West stories, true crime stories, what have you. And that's that initial biography I mentioned before. That's what spurred that. They immediately sent a reporter to Fort Smith, Arkansas to go, and maybe they went to Texas too, I'm not sure, to kind of explore, talk to people who knew her, get the full story. Like I said, they took a lot of creative liberties too and invented a lot of things to romanticize the story. But I think that was when that was, America, the general public, that was their first kind of real glimpse of Belle Starr. And when she went from being just this kind of local figure, this colorful local figure with a checkered past, to being a national sensation. And yeah, from there, like I said, her story kind of took off, and she did, I think, become more or less a household name, or at least something very close to a household name.
Do you think, and Chris, can I jump in?
I guess you already have, Rick.
Oh, that hurt. That hurt. Do you think the pictures have something to do with it? I mean, there's photographs. I think that's got to be, because to me, that was always a big part of when I think of Belle Starr, I think of that photograph of her standing there. And then there's the photograph of her on the horse. There's photographs of her with one of her husbands. So we can see her.
Well, yeah, it's not just her, but I think a lot of these Western figures in general, the photographs also helped their legend come to life. And it's what really secured in the collective consciousness, the public imagination, how these people were. And that's part of the reason too. I think they were so big on always posing with their guns. I think they were aware of this. I think these outlaws, I think they were proud of their persona, but I think to a certain extent they were aware of the power of photography and how potent it could be. And I think to an extent Belle, and I talk about this in the book, not her first trial, but her later trials, the ones where she beat the case, I make the argument that I think she kind of had this very intriguing public relations strategy where, she knew she was going to trial. She was effectively out on bail in Fort Smith. Instead of lying low and trying to pass off as a law-abiding figure, she very blatantly carried herself like an outlaw. She posed for these photos. She posed with Blue Duck. I don't think we have that picture, but this other Cherokee outlaw kind of showing, look, I'm with this guy. She not only didn't conceal it, like she blatantly promoted and celebrated her identity as an outlaw, even giving interviews where she said, I'm a friend to any brave and gallant outlaw with the Dallas paper she was interviewing her with. And I think it was part of this PR strategy where she knew, everyone knew her. She was going to be judged by a jury of her peers, or the judge, have the case dismissed, whether or not it was going to be by the judge. So everyone knew who she was. There was no point in trying to pretend she was a law-abiding citizen. Her one hope, I think, was to just to make sure people understood, I am an outlaw, but I have a code of honor, and I'm not the type of outlaw, I might rob a rich bank, or some Yankee businessmen, carpetbaggers, or whatever, but I'm not just some low-lying, like, yellow-bellied criminal who's some scumbag who's gonna steal horses from poor farmers or hold up just frontier settlers trying to make it. And I argue that I think that was her PR strategy, which she got off the charges, so I guess you could argue that maybe it worked. She ended up beating the rap, and also you could argue too it might have had an element of witness intimidation. And for the armed robbery charge, where this is one of these great mysteries, and I think my personal opinion is that she did it. There was this stick up where her and a few other outlaws with their classic faces covered by bandanas stuck up a couple of local people, and it wasn't a huge score, but they made off with some, I think some money and trinkets and jewelry and stuff like that. And one of the witnesses said, she was confident. It was a female witness who said one of the bandits, I'm convinced, was a woman pretending to be a man, and she was wearing a white hat. And Belle Starr there'd long been these rumors about her dressing up as a man to try to evade capture and things like that. And she also had this white hat she was famous for wearing. And so, and eventually, though, the other witnesses, this was the only witness who stuck to this story that it was a woman. And the other witnesses all said, oh, no, it couldn't have been Belle Starr. It was definitely not Belle Starr, And I think there's very much the potential that part of this campaign PR campaign, these pictures, her talking to the press in the ways that she did, very well could have been a form of witness intimidation as well. And we know from her earlier trial, the first one she went to prison for, one of the witnesses said, Belle Starr blatantly intimidated me, said, if you talk to the authorities, I'm going to waylay your road, which means, like, when you're walking home from the fields, or through the woods, I'm going to shoot you. And apparently it's unclear if she was just trying to intimidate him or if she was aiming and missed. But apparently he said he heard a gunshot one day when he was walking through the woods or whatever, and galloped off. And he was convinced it was her, or at least someone working for her. So there was this kind of history of witness intimidation as well. So possibly you could argue that these pictures serve that factor to kind of intimidate people who might testify, or even other outlaws who might try to muscle in on their turf.
So Dan, I can't bring up the question, but Tammy Stone Strobel would like to know what led you to begin your research on her, and kind of what was the spark there.
Sure, that's a great story, because when I was a little kid, my mom's side of the family, they have the Scots-Irish kind of frontier side. They were farmers in Texas, and when I was growing up, there was always this family legend, and we have a number of stories like this. Some of this I know for a fact are true about outlaws and people getting hung by the neck and stuff like that. But some are a little bit more family lore that I'm not always so certain how true they are. But there was always this bit of family lore that we were distantly related to Belle Starr. And, I never looked into it. I never asked how. I didn't even know that much about Belle Starr and the fact that she was this female bandit outlaw from the Wild West. And it just so happened I was talking to my editor about some ideas for books, and it wasn't even that I was pitching a book about Belle Starr. It just came up in conversation, because I think we're talking about how criminal books about crime were always interesting to the public and things like that. And I think I just mentioned, like, oh, it was funny, I was just talking to a friend about this bit of family lore that we were just related to Belle Starr. And instantly, my editor was just, it was one of these moments when the needle skips off the record. Like, whoa, tell me more about this Belle Starr. And it turns out that, and that's how it happened. Like, he just loved the story, and he said, do you think you could do a book about that? And I said, yeah, I think so. I'd have to do a lot of research, because I just know what my mom told me, which isn't that much. And that's how the story came about. As to whether or not this is true, this family connection to Belle Starr, I won't give it away, but I bet it was ambiguous. And the one distant cousin we're not that distant, but this cousin who supposedly knew the connection had passed away. And so it was a little tricky trying to figure this out. And I won't give it away because I talk about it in the book. But part of the book, and not a major part, but it became part of the book too, this personal angle where I was interested to see if I could find through my research some kind of personal link to Belle Starr and, some sort of familial connection. So that's how it started. And I talk about that in the beginning of the book, and then I kind of close on it as well, sort of a way of bookending the book, how I wanted to solve this mystery, and then what I learned over the course of my research.
So we have a couple of questions, and I'll put up Linda Bunnells, who says, what happened to her children and her husband after her death? But I would add to that Ray Smith's question, does your book include Belle Starr's daughter, who's, I think, went by Pearl Starr?
I do.
Yeah.
I talk about them, and this is, it's fitting with the Wild West outlaw narrative, but it is kind of sad. Things did not end well for Belle Starr, or essentially any of the people she was connected to, and that's part of the reason I chose the title Queen of All Mayhem. And it is just it's a very bloody story, lots of gunfights. I mean, of all of her husbands, I think she had 4 husbands total. Let's see if I'm right. Yeah, 4 husbands total. 3 of them died in gunfights, essentially. So 3 of her 4 husbands were killed by, Wild West lead poisoning, so to speak. And so her last husband, her very last husband she had, was another. It's somewhat ambiguous if you identify it as Cherokee or Choctaw or Creek, but he was a resident of apparently mixed parentage, but a Native American resident of these nations called Jim July. And he was her last husband, and he, shortly after her death, he joined up with a band of outlaws and was killed in a shootout. He didn't die right away, but died in police custody. Was killed in a shootout, an outlaw shootout with authorities. So that's her husband at the time. I believe it was a few months. I don't remember off the top of my head, but I think it was a few months or a year after her death. He died in a shootout. Her son Edwin, who had kind of like apparently a contentious relationship with his mother. She loved him dearly, but I think there was a lot of friction and tension towards the end of their lives. He was also dabbled in outlawry and banditry. He did do some time. He got arrested for theft, did some time, got out of prison, decided he wanted to go straight, and he actually tried to make it as a lawman, as kind of a deputy or whatever, working for the law. So he made an effort to go straight after he got out of prison. And I think there are different versions of this story. I think the true version is he got drunk one night, got in a dispute in a saloon, and he died in a shootout too. He was kind of pulling out his guns and, waving them around and possibly shooting the floor, if I remember correctly, something like that. The saloon owner, if I remember correctly, ended up blowing him away with a shotgun, I think.
It's not safe behavior.
Yeah, so even though he tried to go straight, he did, after his getting involved with some bad characters and crime, did try to make it as a lawman. But I think this sort of, this family, the family tradition of whiskey, mischief, getting into fights, causing trouble, got him into trouble, and he got his ticket punched. He ended up getting shot in the saloon. There's another version of the story that, if I remember correctly, that he was working for law enforcement at the time, and he tried to bust the saloon for, I don't remember what, like whiskey. They were selling illegal whiskey out the back door, something like that. I don't remember the exact version, but there's a version of the story where he was acting as a lawman, trying to, being honorable and trying to break up the ring, and was gunned down. But I personally don't believe that. I've read the newspaper articles from the town of that day, and I think he was just drunk and causing trouble, but it's possible. But that seemed the most truthful to me. And her daughter, Pearl, the version of the story I read, that she actually started working as a prostitute to try to raise money to get her, for the defense of her brother when he went to prison. I'm not sure if that's just a story or if it's true, but that's the story I heard was that's how she first started working in brothels, and she kept on doing that. She continued to work as a prostitute after that, which was probably not the most glorious way to make a living on this sort of frontier, this ragged frontier areas. But I think, if I remember correctly, she did end up working her way up and becoming kind of the madam of her own brothel. And I believe she ended up in Arizona. She is one of the only people who lived to a ripe old age, I believe. So I don't remember the exact time of her death, but she didn't die. She ended up becoming a prostitute and getting involved in the, flesh trafficking business. So it didn't, I guess you could argue it didn't well end great for her either, but she did at least not get killed in a bar brawl or
Right.
something like that.
But by those standards of that family, that's pretty impressive.
So yeah, and it's, I mean, when you look at her family, and even her family back in Missouri, you know, her brother Bud got killed by gunfire, kind of, you know, when he was part of the Confederate militia at the time during the Civil War. I think one of her other brothers I know got killed, got shot off his horse. I know he stole a horse and in Texas and was, you know, essentially, I don't know if it was a posse or a sheriff, but they shot him off his horse. So her other brother died from, you know, getting into trouble, whatever, killed that way. I know one of her other brothers was getting into trouble. I'm not sure if he got killed or not, but I know he was getting into trouble with the law and had to flee. So you know, her family has this. You've already got her immediate family, all these people dying, and you know, her brother's getting killed. Then her husband's, like I said, or her first husband Jim Reed, gunned down by a bounty hunter while he's on the run from the law. Her second husband Sam Starr in the Cherokee Nation dies in a gun duel, kind of defending her honor in a way, because he got in a fight with a Cherokee lawman who'd shot him when he was hiding and killed Belle Starr's favorite horse, Venus. So he ended up getting in a gunfight with this Cherokee lawman and getting gunned down. And then her final husband, Jim July, was the one I mentioned, who after her death went on this tear, joined an outlaw band, was also gunned down by authorities, and died, you know, shortly thereafter in police custody, essentially. So yeah, when you look at and then of course she was gunned down. She was shot off her horse from behind and killed shot at point blank range in the face, basically with a shotgun. So yeah, her family. I mean, that's why I wouldn't say at all it was an exaggeration to say that the Wild West was pretty wild. And I remember I took this one history class at Princeton. It was about the history of the Wild West. And I remember at the time, I really did not like this history class. And I remember sort of almost like the sticking point of this professor was kind of, oh, the Wild West was not what you think. It was all just, you know, land rights and treaties, whatever. And most settlers didn't even own guns, blah, blah, blah. And it was kind of a downer because I remember it just made the West very boring. And I always kind of carried this idea in my head that, oh, maybe it wasn't quite as wild as the Westerns make it out to be. But at least in the case of Belle Starr and her immediate surroundings, it was unbelievably violent. And yeah, it was, I would argue, even more violent than what I expected and what I'd come to see in Westerns. It was just very, very bloody, lots of crime, lots of banditry, and lots of gunfights and bloodshed.
Well, Dane Hucklebridge, thank you so much for joining us to chat about Belle Starr. And we ended up going over time, but no problem, because it's History Happy Hour. Right. We can do whatever we want. Right, Chris? Right?
Absolutely.
And I want to say that Dane Hucklebridge is the author of Queen of All Mayhem. You can order it on Amazon. Go to your bookstore. It comes out on Tuesday. We wish you the best of luck with that. And Dane, thank you so much for joining us today.
Certainly. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Dane. Appreciate it.
Next week, a subject suggested by one of our faithful audience members, Doug McCord. And we'll be talking to an artist from New Zealand, Sue Hayden, about her father's World War II experience. She's made an exhibition about it and written up something as George's War. And so something different we're trying, so we'll see how it goes, and I'm sure it'll be interesting.
Now, I'm curious, is she going to do this live, or like our Australian guests, or are we pre-recording?
Apparently the time difference is such with New Zealand that somehow we can do it live.
Wow. Okay.
I don't know what weird time it'll be for her, but
Who's going to be outside on a porch with a glass of wine? The sun's going to be shining.
I don't know. All of these things could be true, or it could be the middle of the night in the winter. It won't be winter. It'll be warm, right?
Yes.
So it'll be like June-ish for New Zealand. We haven't had anybody from New Zealand on before.
No, it's the first. No.
Right, so live across the world.
History Hour spans the globe.
We hope the technology can hold up. We're laying the cable right now. We have satellites are being transposed. Okay. Please subscribe to us on YouTube. Follow us on Facebook. Shout out us on Blue Sky. Listen to our podcast. Back us on Patreon. And if you feel like looking at our 279 previous shows, go to historyhappyhour.com.
Indeed. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.